everyone. How's it going? How was lunch?
Good.
Is everyone still with me? Everyone still awake? Still rolling? I promise I'm trying to make this as pain-free as possible. So a little bit about myself. My name is Yadira. I'm a creative technologist at Hulu. And so what that means is that I'm kind of in the divide between UX and development. We do a lot of concept work, a lot of prototyping, hence why you're here, talking about prototypes. A little bit more about my background. I'm actually from Colorado, so I'm a Colorado native. I'm from Colorado Springs, actually, and I did my undergrad at CU Boulder. That's 2016. So yeah, let's get started. So as I said, I'm kind of in that divide between design and development. And as you can see, I made this very intentional. There's a very small gap. And while I know that a lot of teams now have felt like they're very collaborative, I've seen a lot of gaps still. There's still a lot of handoff and deliverables that seem to be mismatched between design and development. And so where does prototyping fall along those lines? You know, where does that fall within the design methodologies, the design process? Because generally that's where it starts, right? That's where we go into this handoff, we go into this deliverable, onto the next team, onto the next department. So yeah, amongst those, you know, I want to get a little bit of a gauge in the room. How many people are here are designers? Okay. Developers? Anybody in between? Products. There we go. So yeah, so really what this talk is about is trying to figure out where we can start overlapping a bit more, where we can start being more collaborative and more cohesive within the teams. So a bit of another question, I'm trying to keep this interactive so we don't fall asleep. How often do your teams prototype? Does anyone have a process for that? Any examples of like how often do you prototype, or do you even prototype at all? Anybody?
We attempt to do weekly design sprints and get it up on user testing within a few days, theoretically.
Anybody else?
Every time?
Yeah, so one thing that I also want to start breaking a little bit is that cycle of the design cycle, where we always have to, you know, we start off with a design, we start off with ideation, and somewhere along the lines, prototyping ends up in the back end, right before we start validating. I think that there's a lot of room for prototypes to evolve as a design evolves. So I want to start shifting the way we think about prototypes as just a part of the design process, but really as a growth and evolution within the design process. So yeah, as we were talking about, there's different design methodologies, right? And a lot of these like look really similar. You start off with some research problems, you start off with ideating solutions, hypotheses. They all appear very linear, even though like we look at them very cyclically. A lot of them have step-by-step process. And even though we think like, oh, okay, we're an agile team, a lot of what I've seen in a lot of patterns of teams end up following the design sprint, exactly. Where we kind of understand a problem, we define it, we narrow it down, we refine what it is that we're trying to validate. Generally, designers from there go into sketch mode. You know, they start wireframing, they start building out mock-ups, whether that be at different levels of fidelity depending on where in the design process you are. You know, and then we move on to prototyping, right? And again, I want to start breaking that cycle a little bit and thinking of like, how can we start prototyping to gain alignment within a team? Without necessarily having to go to prototype as proof of concept, as a demo, but really like just internally gathering what the direction is. So I'm sure that many of you guys have seen mock-ups that look like this, right? You've at some point maybe seen it, maybe handed that off as a designer, of just a really basic wireframe, right? You don't have any visual design, but why does it have to necessarily just be in that mock? A lot of times when I see mocks like this, I see a little bit more room to make it come to life. So you can actually start doing like your interaction design. What does that look like? Even within a wireframe, you start ideating what it should be and what it should look like and what it should feel like within just simple interactions and animations. So like, for example, at Hulu, what I actually do is I do take a lot of that. I mix it a lot. We actually evolve the prototype as the design goes. We don't wait until the very end to start building out these prototypes, to start building out these sort of layouts and interactions. We really start from, even if something isn't fully done in visual design, we start building these up, and they actually start to tell a story. You actually start to get a feel for this prototype that's telling you the design process without necessarily having to verbalize it to you. Similarly, you can start doing very, very simple mock-ups with really minimal animations. And I think one of those things is to really start exploring what your options are and what your design tools are. So another reason I want to bring up prototyping is not necessarily just for product. I think a lot of times we think of prototyping as just a piece of the design process, but we don't really take it beyond what we visually see. Usually a prototype is like a proof of concept for what a visual design is supposed to be like, kind of like what our end product is. But here's a really interesting use case of where I use a prototype. So as you can see, this is supposed to be a text-to-speech accessibility spec, which is really funny because the template that we were given, the format that we were given, isn't actually that accessible itself. But really, it was supposed to be like, here's your script. We do this for every single button, every single interaction. One, it gets really tedious to do these scripts and then try to hand off to development. But also, like, it doesn't actually convey anything to us. It doesn't really tell us how it's supposed to feel and how it's supposed to look like and feel like. Because text-to-speech is actually also has a visual component to it. That even if it's meant to be for visually impaired folks, there still is some sort of tactile interaction that has that, and the script doesn't really give us any of that. So hopefully, sound will work. It's not. Okay, sorry about that. Really, the idea here was, excuse the really poor design, but this was really just a mock-up to illustrate that piece. So I actually used Adobe XD's speech playback. And no, I'm not promoting particular products, but this really goes to show that there's different tools out there to be able to convey a message at different levels of what you need. So what this was meant to do was when you tap it, it actually triggers speech playback. So it's supposed to emulate what a screen reader is supposed to be like. And so if you have to implement that accessibility component into your applications, you can prototype that really quickly and do like a testing round to make sure that it works, it's enabled, and you can actually do this sort of handoff versus like pages and pages of scripts. Because they're all integrated, you visually see which buttons are supposed to interact with what. And a lot of times when you default to like third-party integrations of screen readers, what ends up happening a lot of time is that because it's on mobile, everything is read as a button. Because everything, so to speak, is an action. And so that's not always the case, right? So you want to make sure that if you're able to like integrate that, you want to be able to see that. And so this is one of those types of prototypes that you can do that isn't necessarily for the product, it's not necessarily for demo, but really just for internal alignment within your teams to really understand like what does development need to do, what does design need to do, and also like what is more like back-end work that needs to be done to implement these scripts. So there's a lot of prototyping tools. So it's like, where do I start, right? Like, there's a bunch of them, like InVision has their studio. A lot of people use Sketch to prototype. A lot of people use click-through prototypes through InVision, just itself without necessarily using their design tools. There's Principle, there's Figma, there's Framer X. So it's like, what does that all mean, right? Where do you start? Really, the way I see it is if you're gonna have either someone dedicated on your teams to prototype, or if you want to start exploring prototyping yourself, it really means that you have to be a jack of all trades. There's not going to be one particular tool that's going to be able to handle everything for you. And there's also times where, so I have a background in front-end development, and I still have to bring that resource once in a while. If I have to do some web design, or if I have to bring some component of the web to life, I usually do end up just coding it in React as a form of proof of concept. So there's a lot of different ways to utilize things, and really what it means is that we shouldn't restrict ourselves. So while a lot of design teams use, very standardized practices, I'm sure a lot of design teams here use Sketch as a means of designing. The design itself doesn't have to be limited to the prototyping tool, right? And so really it's more about gauging where you can start learning these tools and learning its limitations. So, for example, I was going to do a live session, but I wanted to be on the safer side. But really, what I'm trying to demo here is that there's essentially, like, let's say that you are at Netflix. You are trying to design trays, and you're trying to design scrollable content within a tray, right? This is just a really simple demo to show how two completely different tools have really different mental models on how to use them to achieve exactly the same type of prototype. The reason I bring this up is because there are many, many different skill sets, right? And so many designers don't necessarily want to learn code, but there may also be developers that want to touch into design, right? So diving a little bit more, this particular tool I'm using here is Framer X. It's a really great tool for prototyping, but it's also a really good tool to start building that relationship with your development team. A lot of the components that you can build in Framer X actually are React components. So if you're doing design systems and you want to start translating that into your design teams, into your development teams, you can work hand in hand to actually build these code components that actually work through handoff to the development team. So they don't actually have to start from scratch or start picking apart your Zeppelin files or redlining any of that. It's a really cohesive program, and also allows for API integration. So if you really want to take that design and really bring it to life without necessarily going through the effort of development, it's really easy to start building up those teams. Adobe XD is really great as one of those tools to do really rapid prototyping. It does have, it's really similar to Flash, if anyone's ever used that. It's a really older kind of animation tool, but it kind of works in keyframes. So you can really take your time to redesign that. Almost all of these tools I'm mentioning have at a component level in design. So if you want to create sort of these components that you're not going to change, or that you might want to just do simple overrides, so you can start having your component libraries in there. Also, a lot of these tools work really great with abstract. So if any of your teams want to start building out your design system and really kind of being able to do version control within the design team, and I know that's a little bit newer, abstract is a really great tool. And so really, I just want to touch on all of these different pieces, because this is where we can start thinking of prototypes in a really different way and really start bringing really your 2D sketch files to life. You can start bringing your designs to life without necessarily having to master a new tool, without really necessarily having to master coding per se, or animation tools. It's really simplified design tools that have started integrating this, and I think that that's where that room to start building out these prototypes for development can bridge a lot of these gaps. You start bridging a lot of technical gaps. You start bridging a lot of interaction design versus describing things. You can physically show people what you're trying to translate. So again, just kind of wrapping that back into it, really touching on how these tools, how prototyping can really start closing up that, really bringing more overlap between design and development. Overall, I think that this is still really niched environments. I feel like there's a lot of frameworks that have made it really easy, a lot of design tools that have made it really easy, but there's still somehow a gap. There's still somehow a disconnect between what developers receive and what designers try to emulate, right? And so I think that if we were able to kind of bridge that gap a little bit, learn these different tools, really kind of take that time to explore what prototypes mean, versus like towards the end, towards a demo, towards a proof of concept. We're really kind of evolving that as it goes along. Yeah. I try to make this really short, really painless. I know it's after lunch, so really I wanted this to be more conversational. Yeah, so any questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So thinking about a lot of the different prototyping tools, so for example, with Framer, I feel like the learning curve is a little bit harder than like XD, especially if you're used to other Adobe design products. So do you feel like it's an advantage to really double down on learning something like that? When say you might go to another company and they just still want to sketch, or they want to use Figma only, or different things like that. Like when you double down on one thing, does that have an advantage or disadvantage as compared to really maybe knowing how to use all of them?
Yeah, so I think the idea here is not necessarily that you have to be a master of them. I think that there is really kind of like an art to being able to learn enough to be able to push that forward. The reason I say that is because even as like formerly a developer, like tools were coming out constantly and wrapping my head around like, oh, okay, like there's this new library, there's this new framework coming out, like they just updated this framework that I was using like 2 months ago. Like things move really rapidly. And I feel like the design space is also moving really rapidly. And I feel like there's a certain pressure that designers feel now to like learn coding basics, learn programming. But I really feel like these kinds of tools allow for that learning to happen without necessarily jumping into it. Like you're not gonna come out like a front-end developer, right? But I think there's still an art to trying to learning these tools. There's also a bunch of resources out there that sort of guide that specifically for designers. And I feel like that's where my role, like specifically at Hulu, comes in a really sweet spot, where I did have that development background, so I was able to facilitate that. But there's also still a lot of design work that comes into those tools. A lot of these interactions are built-in tools, or there are a lot of plugins. So it's really like learning and navigating and playing with the tool versus like learning how to code completely or learning everything from scratch. I think there's an art to that. I really do encourage a lot of my team members as well to like start exploring. I work with a lot of designers who are strictly designers, right? They don't really leave outside of the design bubble. But I think as companies start kind of trying to close that, as front-end developers are becoming a lot more design savvy, as well as designers becoming a bit more code savvy, I think it's worth the investment of at least exploration.
What do you think about tools that that seek to eliminate tools for developers that seek to eliminate the designer, and tools for designers like Webflow, for example, that seek to eliminate a developer?
Yeah, it's funny because I still feel that these tools are not perfect, right? Like there's still a need for these people. There's still a need for a developer. There's still a need for a designer. I feel like that's a common concern, and I feel like that's why from design there's a lot of pushback, right? They're like, well, I don't want to be a developer. I'm not trying to be a developer. And I'm not trying to eliminate that role. What I think there is, though, is an advantage to learn something from that. I feel like instead of pushing back on these tools, we should kind of embrace them and really try to adapt them to what we need versus like trying to like automate, right? Like I feel like that's like a really big buzzword around everything, is trying to automate things and make things seamless. But the reality is that there's still a need for those people. Like, for example, like there is a lot of like Webflow, or like even like when Zeppelin came out, you know, it was like eliminating the need for redlining designs for like creating these specs. But they're still not perfect. There's still a lot of disconnect even in those tools. Like they're working towards becoming better, but there's still a need for someone to implement it correctly. There's a certain depth of knowledge that I think can't be replaced, but I definitely see the advantage of those tools helping understand that, right? Helping designers understand technical constraints. Because I feel like that's still a really common thing, that a designer wants to build something that isn't actually gonna fit what like is happening on the back end and how that translates into the front end. And vice versa. I feel like there's still a lot of front end developers that don't necessarily understand all the aspects of design, and there's still that need to refine that.
I have a question. So you mentioned Framer X, like port stuff to React to kind of get rid of that redlining need. Can you talk about how you use it at your gig, and then maybe like how you got buy-in from both like engineering and design?
Yeah, and so I think that's a really great question. We're still trying to navigate the perfect process, right? That's like always the end goal for it. Really what it is we started developing a design system, right? And a lot of times these design systems exist in Sketch as kind of like our own components. And then, we try to hand these off to developers, but they're still copying and pasting pixels, they're still copying and pasting text codes. And it's helpful, but there's still room for improvement. And so that's where we started really leveraging Framer X, is that we started building up not necessarily all of a design because our layouts change constantly, we're always ideating new things, but really like our core components that we know are not going to change, like buttons, headers, things that we know are going to stay consistent. We've allowed for really like pairing off a developer and a designer to really kind of talk through these things, and then we build these out, and Framer X has an ability to connect to GitHub. So once we build out those React components, they exist in our repositories, and so they can just pull these components from there.
Sweet.
Any other questions?
This is slightly off topic, but reacting to something you said. As a product manager, I know a lot of times what I've tried to work on with my design and development teams is trying to get that early communication of both kind of priorities and complexity. Do you have any examples of kind of how you've been able to do that successfully?
Yeah, so I think this is just overall like my team and how we work. I think what we try to do is make sure that there's always like a kickoff meeting, right? And it's usually involves like some form of stakeholders, product, and maybe like leads on a team versus like, lead designers and lead developers. But really what we've tried to do and integrate is having those meetings with the people that are actually involved in the process. I think that that's really, really important. Because they start wrapping their head around what's actually happening and like really understanding the requirements from their perspective versus like a trickle down requirement that may have lots of nuances along the way. So I definitely think that's helpful. I also really encourage like product to get involved earlier in the ideation processes, right? I think that there's a lot of room. A lot of what I've seen is like product usually, hands off requirements. They're managing a lot of things, right? So I understand that there can't always be accessible in terms of like the work that goes in day to day. But I think along those lines, like where prototyping happens is we can start evolving that and changing those conversations so that like we can catch things earlier rather than later. We can start changing things earlier rather than waiting until something is almost complete. Right, and so being more agile, really.
So with that in mind, what do you say to people? I feel like the biggest pushback is PMs don't want so much back and forth. They want every job I've ever had, like the designs are 100% finalized. And then I, as the developer, get an XD or sketch file with 45 screenshots that I have to match. So at what point, what do you say to the people who want all designs finalized right away? Because it sounds like you're saying there should be more collaboration and constant.
Yeah. Exactly. That's actually what I've been trying to avoid in my role. That's actually why my role was created absolutely, was because we were very disjointed. And like our developers are awesome, they work with UX really well, but there, like I said, there's still sort of like this gap, right? Where like all of a sudden they just got handed off an entire feature, an entire project. And that had to do with how UX was kind of wrapped under product, and then like development was its own thing. And so it was just like really just trying to shift the culture. I know that that's like a really big ask, but really trying to shift that and trying to you as a developer like involve yourself more in the design process, or also maybe open like the invitation for designers to kind of get a glimpse into your world. I think that until that collaboration happens, it's gonna kind of stay in that cyclical like pace, right? Where all of a sudden you're gonna get 40 pages of design. Whereas like when you're starting, like that's also why I push for prototypes and prototyping early, even at like a wireframe level. Because if you start making that visible and having that transparency, you as a developer can already start ideating how you want to implement that. And if you start seeing those technical constraints that you're like, you know what, this is not going to work, you can stop that earlier in the process with that visibility versus waiting until implementation to realize that, you know, you're delaying a project and it's not really on you, but that's just how it waterfalls down. Yeah.
Same thing sort of goes the other direction as the engineer views the concept, sort of developed in a bubble without any sort of design thinking associated to it. I was wondering, like, I guess it's what you're saying, that collaboration is the key.
Yeah, I think that, the reason like I wanted to point out like, and I push for prototyping a lot, is because that's really what like shifted the way that we worked a lot. Because it provided kind of like a really high level insight into what's happening without going into like a case study form from design, or without having to really go into like technical like specs or like kind of like that pushback. I think that allowed for a lot of people to start getting a really high level view of where the direction that we're going into. And so when individual either stakeholders or individual teams or individual contributors even started noticing like disparities within what's reasonable, what's out of scope, they were able to bring that up a lot sooner because they were offered that visibility. They were able to kind of see where it started evolving versus waiting until like, hey, we need to demo this to validate or to test. There is a lot of that insight that like prototyping early was able to give us like at a really high level.